Many thanks to Joab, Jaren, DayZ Podcast, Taggy's Tag West, Black Knight and Lion Lost for making this video possible. DayZ 1.15 changed some recoil numbers to create some freaking laser beam guns in this patch, while also changing the RPM of several weapons that they changed the recoil values for too, creating a lot of confusion as to how recoil has actually changed in patch 1.15. So in this video I'm going to go over which weapons have changed, how they've changed, and explain what Tifa, Jugs and the DayZ dev team have in common. Now, in order to understand what has changed when it comes to recoil in this patch, we must first understand a little bit about how recoil works in DayZ. In the game code for DayZ, believe it or not, there are many numbers. Some of these numbers determine how far a gun will jump up when you press the fire button. This jump up number is fixed and will always be the same and will jump your weapon up the exact same amount every single time you fire your weapon. However, in order to not make recoil as predictably bad as CSGO, the devs have generated an invisible square that appears each time your weapon jumps up to create some randomness. So first your gun jumps up, then it creates an invisible square, generates a spot inside that square at random, then finally tells your gun to point at the generated spot, and it does this every single time that you fire your weapon. This can be further broken down into just two elements, jumps up and generates spot, which can be called jugs for short. Now, the reason I'm exposing the DayZ developers jugs to you is because these two elements are the best way to nerf or buff a gun's recoil in DayZ, and to explain how, I need the help of my special guest for this video, Tifa Lockhart, who is very talented when it comes to jugs.
If the jumps up part of recoil goes up in value, so too does the distance it jumps up. The higher it goes up, the higher the recoil. The generated spot is like this. The generated spot can appear anywhere inside this square. The bigger the square, the more unpredictable the recoil, so the smaller the square, the closer the generated spots become.
Thanks Tifa. To demonstrate this in game, the SVD in 1.15 was buffed when it comes to the size of this square. On the left is 1.14 and on the right is 1.15. You may not see a difference here, but you will certainly feel a difference when it comes to the SVD in 1.15. In 1.14, SVD recoil is very unpredictable due to the generated spot being a lot more random because it can appear anywhere inside this blue square, where in 1.15 this square is over 50% smaller. So to put everything you've learned in this video together, the gun jumps up a certain and predictable amount, then it lands on the randomly generated spot, then it repeats from this point the next time that you fire, creating what I'll just call the recoil cycle. Because the red squares on the right are smaller, it results in a much more predictable pattern, as you can see, which becomes very apparent when we try to compare fighting the recoil between patch 1.14 and 1.15. In the SVD's case, the jumps up recoil part hasn't been changed at all in value, but its stability has been increased by 50% due to this square now being 50% smaller, making the SVD much easier to control and as a result much more deadly in close quarters combat in this patch. Now that all of that is explained, we can move on to the next weapon, which is the most buffed weapon in patch 1.15, and it very much needed this buff, the VSS and the AS VAL. Not only did it get a huge buff from its 600 RPM up to 900 RPM this patch, but the distance it jumps up in recoil has been halved, and so has the size of the square halved again. So vertical recoil has been much improved along with its stability, resulting in an incredibly deadly weapon in close quarters now with its 900 RPM, and that's without even considering the fact that it's the only weapon to accept armor-piercing rounds. Now, you may believe that recoil gets worse because it's gone from 600 to 900 RPM, but that is not the case. The recoil cycle I was talking about earlier works based on the RPM of the weapon and has to complete one full cycle before it can fire again. So the speed a weapon completes a recoil cycle or jumps up and then generates a spot will always be in line with the RPM of that weapon, which means firing a weapon slowly like this generates the exact same amount of recoil as spamming full auto. To demonstrate this further and easier, this is the M4 in 1.14 on the left, which has 600 RPM, and this is the M4 in 1.15 on the right, which now has 900 RPM. So even though the M4 fires 50% faster in patch 1.15, it doesn't produce any more recoil than it used to. It only means that you need to move your mouse slightly faster downwards when you fire this weapon. The next weapon on the list got the biggest recoil buff of all weapons in DayZ in this patch, and that is the UMP. The jump up value is now 25% of what it was in 1.14, and the square has been reduced by 50% too, resulting in a monster difference in recoil, as you can see here. Now, after doing some testing with controlling the recoil, you don't really need to control the recoil in this weapon. It is literally a laser beam. The only weapon to get a recoil nerf in this patch is the MP5, otherwise known as the SG5 K. While the square's size of the MP5 was not changed, or the generated spot was not changed, the jump up vertical recoil part was by 66% more than it was in 1.14. However, while the 1.14 MP5 was easier to control, there's not a huge difference when it comes to the best recoil reducing attachments on the MP5. Just be aware that it will certainly feel different in this patch, especially with the 50% RPM buff. The final weapon to get a recoil buff in this patch was the FAMAS, and this one is much like the SVD in terms of its buff. Basically, the size of this square has been reduced by 50% again, resulting in a much easier to control FAMAS that now rivals the capabilities of the M4, due to the FAMAS also getting a sneaky damage buff in patch 1.15. If you want to learn more about the FAMAS's damage buff, you can do so in this video, or alternatively, if you want to learn more about the recoil numbers and what has changed exactly, you can find them on the WOBO website now. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.